October 12th, 1957. The skies over Lake Michigan were crystal clear, the kind of autumn afternoon that makes pilots dream of flying. At exactly 2:20 p.m., a silver P-51 Mustang roared down the runway of Traverse City Airport, its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine cutting through the peaceful Michigan air like a blade. At the controls sat Michael Roberts, 42 years old, veteran bomber pilot, father of two, and a man who had survived 37 missions over Nazi Bonanz, Germany without a scratch. By 4:15 p.m. that same day, both Michael Roberts and his beloved Mustang had vanished without a trace. No distress call, no wreckage, no body. Just silence where there should have been the thunderous return of a legendary aircraft. The search that followed would involve hundreds of volunteers, Coast Guard vessels, and aircraft from 3 states. It would last for months, and it would find absolutely nothing. But this story doesn't end there, because 18 years later, in the summer of 1975, a group of recreational divers would stumble upon something impossible. 22 feet below the surface of that same lake, resting upright on the sandy bottom as if it had simply decided to land there, sat Michael Roberts's P-51 Mustang, nearly intact, perfectly preserved. And inside, still strapped into the pilot's seat, the answers to a mystery that had haunted a community for nearly 2 decades. If you're fascinated by aviation, mysteries and cases that defy explanation, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happened in the final moments before this legendary aircraft disappeared will challenge everything you think you know about how planes crash. This is the story of a hero who survived the deadliest war in human history, only to vanish on a perfect autumn day. This is the story of a family that lived with uncertainty for 18 years. And this is the story of a discovery that would finally bring closure, but raise even more disturbing questions. Michael Anthony Roberts stood 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that still carried the bearing of a military man 12 years after the war had ended. His hair, once jet black, had turned distinguished silver at the temples, and his piercing blue eyes had seen things most men could only imagine in nightmares. Those eyes had watched B-17 bombers explode in midair over Berlin. They had tracked enemy fighters through clouds of flak over Dresden. They had witnessed the liberation of Europe from 25,000 feet. But in 1957, those same eyes were filled with a different kind of light. Joy, peace, the simple pleasure of a man who had found his purpose in civilian life. Born in Grand Rapids, Michigan, on March 15, 1915, Michael had grown up during the Great Depression, the eldest son of a factory worker and a schoolteacher. His childhood was marked by scarcity, but never by lack of love. His mother would later recall how young Michael spent hours building model airplanes from scraps of wood and paper, hanging them from the ceiling of the bedroom he shared with his 2 younger brothers. He would lie on his back and stare at those planes for hours, she told reporters in 1957. Even then, I knew the sky was calling him. When war broke out in Europe, Michael was 26 years old, working as a mechanic at an automobile factory. He enlisted 3 days after Pearl Harbor. His mechanical aptitude and steady hands caught the attention of his superiors immediately, and by 1943 he was piloting B-17 flying fortresses over occupied Europe. His service record was nothing short of remarkable. 37 combat missions, 3 aircraft shot out from under him, 2 Purple Hearts, a Distinguished Flying Cross. But Michael rarely spoke about the war. His wife, Catherine, a petite brunette with warm brown eyes whom he'd married in 1944 during a brief leave, said he would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, but would only shake his head when she asked what he'd dreamed. "The war stays in the past," he would tell her quietly. "I'm home now. That's what matters." And home was everything to Michael Roberts. By 1957, he and Catherine had 2 teenage children. David, 17, tall and athletic like his father, with dreams of becoming an engineer, and Susan, 15, artistic and sensitive, who inherited her father's precise attention to detail. They lived in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street in Traverse City, with a workshop in the garage where Michael and David would spend Saturday mornings restoring old engines and building model airplanes, just as Michael had done as a boy. Michael's post-war career was built entirely around his 2 great loves, aviation and teaching. He worked as a flight instructor at Traverse City Airport, patient and methodical, with a reputation for turning nervous students into confident pilots. His colleagues described him as meticulous to the point of obsession. Mike would inspect an aircraft 3 times before he'd let anyone take it up, recalled George Patterson, the airport manager in 1957. He'd check the fuel, the oil, the control surfaces, then check them all again. He trusted his life to those machines, but he verified everything personally. But Michael's true passion was his P-51 Mustang. He'd purchased the surplus fighter in 1953, spending 4 years and virtually every spare dollar restoring it to pristine condition. The aircraft, painted in gleaming silver with red trim, was his pride and joy. He would fly it at air shows throughout Michigan, performing graceful aerobatic displays that drew crowds of hundreds. Children would press against the airfield fences, watching in awe as Michael executed perfect barrel rolls and loops, the Merlin engine's distinctive roar echoing across the countryside. "That plane was his therapy," Catherine would later tell investigators. "After the war, he had nightmares for years, but when he was flying, especially in that Mustang, he was at peace. It was the only time I ever saw him truly relaxed." On Friday evenings, Michael had a ritual. He would return home from the airport, have dinner with his family, and then retreat to his small home office, where he kept meticulous logs of every flight he'd ever made since, returning from the war. Weather conditions, aircraft performance, fuel consumption. Every detail recorded in his precise, block-letter handwriting. He was a man who left nothing to chance, who believed that preparation and attention to detail were what separated the living from the dead. His students loved him. His family adored him. His community respected him. Michael Roberts was, by every measure, a man who had found his place in the world after surviving the unimaginable chaos of war. That Friday morning, October 11th, 1957, Michael kissed Catherine goodbye at 6:30 a.m., ruffled David's hair as his son rushed to catch the school bus, and drove his 1955 Chevrolet pickup truck to the airport. He had a full day of lessons scheduled, followed by a solo flight on Saturday afternoon. A simple demonstration flight over the lake, he'd told Catherine. He'd done it hundreds of times before. "I'll be back by 5, he'd said, standing in the doorway, in his leather flight jacket, those blue eyes crinkling with the smile that had first made Catherine fall in love with him 13 years earlier. "We're still on for dinner at Miller's Steakhouse, right?" Catherine smiled. 6 o'clock sharp. "Don't be late, flyboy." Michael winked. "Have I ever been late?" Those would be the last words she would ever hear him speak. Saturday, October 12th, 1957, dawned with the kind of weather that pilots dream about. A high-pressure system had settled over northern Michigan, bringing crystalline blue skies and temperatures in the low 60s. The wind was a gentle 6 knots from the southwest. Visibility extended for miles in every direction. By every metric, it was a perfect day for flying. Michael arrived at Traverse City Airport at 9:30 a.m., carrying his worn leather flight bag and a thermos of coffee Catherine had prepared. Several witnesses would later recall seeing him that morning, and all described him in identical terms: relaxed, cheerful, looking forward to the flight. There was no indication whatsoever that anything was amiss. He spent nearly an hour performing his pre-flight inspection of the P-51 Mustang. This was vintage Michael Roberts, meticulous and thorough. He walked around the aircraft 3 complete times, checking every surface, every rivet, every control. He climbed up to inspect the engine, his hands moving with the practiced confidence of a man who had done this thousands of times. He checked the fuel tanks personally, watching as the line crew topped them off with 100-octane aviation gas. Full tanks. Plenty for a 3-hour flight with reserve. "Everything look good, Mike?" asked Tommy Breslin, a young mechanic who idolized the veteran pilot. Michael gave him a thumbs up. "Clean as a whistle, Tommy. She's ready to go." At 1:45 p.m., Michael filed his flight plan with the airport tower. It was a simple route. Take off to the west, climb to 5,000 feet, then head north over Lake Michigan for approximately 50 miles before turning back. A scenic loop over the coastline, nothing unusual. Estimated flight time, 2 hours and 15 minutes. Expected return, 4:15 p.m. The tower controller, a veteran operator named Frank Morrison, would remember the conversation vividly for the rest of his life. Mike's voice was totally normal, he told investigators. He joked about taking the scenic route to avoid his wife's shopping list. There wasn't a trace of concern in his voice. At 2:20 p.m. exactly, Michael Roberts throttled up the Merlin engine and roared down runway 28. Multiple witnesses watched the takeoff, and all agreed it was textbook perfect. The silver Mustang lifted gracefully into the autumn sky, banked to the right, and began climbing steadily toward the north. For the next hour and 27 minutes, everything proceeded normally. Michael checked in with the tower at regular intervals, his transmissions clear and professional. At 2:35 p.m., he reported passing 5,000 feet and leveling off. At 3:10 p.m., he reported reaching his northernmost point and beginning his turn back toward Traverse City. The weather remained perfect. No problems reported. Then, at 3:47 p.m., something changed. Traverse Tower. This is Mustang November 7-3, Charlie. Michael's voice came through clearly, but there was something different about it. Not panic, not fear, but a note of concentration. "I'm experiencing some minor engine roughness. Nothing serious, but I'm going to descend to 2,000 feet and take a closer look." Frank Morrison's response was immediate. "Roger, 7-3 Charlie. Do you need to declare an emergency?" "Negative, Tower. Just a precaution. Engine's still running smooth, just a slight vibration. I'm going to throttle back and see if it smooths out." "Copy that. Keep me updated." What happened in the next 8 minutes would become one of aviation's most perplexing mysteries. Because at 3:55 p.m., Michael Roberts made his final transmission. "Tower, 7-3 Charlie. Roughness has smoothed out, but I'm going to stay low and take the direct route home over the lake. Should be back in 20 minutes. "Roger, 7-3 Charlie. We'll be watching for you." That was the last anyone ever heard from Michael Roberts. At 4:15 p.m., when the Mustang failed to appear, Frank Morrison tried to raise Michael. On the radio. No response. He tried again at 4:20. Silence. By 4:25, he had initiated emergency protocols, and by 4:30, a massive search operation was beginning to mobilize. But there was a group of people who may have witnessed what happened next, though they didn't realize the full gravity until much later. 3 fishermen in a small boat on Lake Michigan, approximately 8 miles north of Traverse City, heard what they described as a plane engine that suddenly got very quiet. One of them, Harold Jensen, a retired postal worker, looked up and saw a silver aircraft flying low over the water, perhaps 500 feet up. It was moving real slow, Jensen told investigators the next day. Not like it was in trouble, more like the pilot was just cruising along, taking his time. Then we heard the engine kind of sputter, and the plane started descending. Not falling, understand, but descending in a controlled way, like he was lining up for a water landing. What Jensen described next would provide crucial details for investigators. The plane kept getting lower and lower, real gentle-like, the nose slightly up like he was flaring for landing. Then it touched down on the water. We saw the splash, a big white spray that went up maybe 20 feet. The plane skipped once, like a stone on water, then settled. We thought for sure the pilot would climb out. But then, maybe 10 or 15 seconds later, the nose dipped forward and the whole thing just slid under the surface. Real smooth, real quiet. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. The 3 men had immediately motored toward the area where they'd seen the plane go down, but by the time they reached the spot, there was nothing. No debris floating on the surface, no oil slick, no sign that an aircraft had just vanished into the lake. They searched for over an hour, marking the approximate location as best they could, before returning to shore and reporting what they'd seen. By nightfall on October 12th, Catherine Roberts knew something was terribly wrong. Her husband had never, not once in their 13 years of marriage, been late without calling. When the doorbell rang at 7:30 p.m., and she saw George Patterson, the airport manager, standing on her porch with 2 sheriff's deputies, her blood ran cold. The search for Michael Roberts and his P-51 Mustang became one of the largest rescue operations in Michigan history. Within hours of his disappearance, Coast Guard vessels from 3 stations were converging on the area where the fishermen had reported seeing the aircraft go down. By Sunday morning, more than a dozen boats were searching the lake, while 3 aircraft flew grid patterns overhead, looking for any sign of wreckage. The response from the community was immediate and overwhelming. Michael Roberts was beloved in Traverse City, and the thought that he might be out there, possibly alive, possibly waiting for rescue, drove hundreds of volunteers to join the search. Men who had flown with Michael during the war drove through the night from as far away as Illinois and Ohio. Local pilots volunteered their aircraft for aerial searches. Divers from a Navy Reserve unit in Detroit drove up to assist with underwater search operations. But Lake Michigan is vast and cold and unforgiving. The area where Michael had likely gone down covered approximately 50 square miles. And despite the fisherman's eyewitness account, pinpointing an exact location on open water with no fixed landmarks proved nearly impossible. The depth in that region ranged from 15 to over 100 feet, and despite their best efforts, there was no debris field to narrow down the search. Lead investigator Detective Raymond Walsh of the Michigan State Police coordinated the effort with military precision. "We divided the search area into grids," he told reporters on day 3. "Every grid is being searched systematically by boat and by air. We have sonar equipment scanning the bottom. We will not stop until we find him." But the sonar equipment available in 1957 was primitive by any standard. Designed primarily for detecting large objects like sunken ships or submarines, the resolution was poor, capable of detecting objects only if they were at least 10 to 15 feet in size and sitting proud on the bottom. A single aircraft, especially one that might be partially buried in sediment, could easily be missed. And there was another problem that investigators didn't fully appreciate at the time. That particular stretch of Lake Michigan's bottom was littered with debris. Decades of shipping traffic had left hundreds of objects on the lakebed. Anchors, chains, old dock pilings, scattered wreckage from boats, even a few small vessels that had sunk over the years. Each of these objects created a sonar signature, and distinguishing one piece of metal from another was nearly impossible with 1957 technology. The theories began almost immediately. Some suggested mechanical failure, a catastrophic engine problem that left Michael no choice but to ditch in the lake. The witnesses had described a controlled descent, which supported this theory. But why hadn't Michael been able to escape the aircraft? Others proposed that Michael had become disoriented or incapacitated, though this seemed unlikely for a pilot of his experience on such a clear day. The fact that he'd executed what appeared to be a textbook water landing suggested he'd been fully in control until the very end. More disturbing theories emerged as well. Some speculated that Michael had deliberately crashed, though those who knew him dismissed this immediately. Mike had everything to live for, his friend Tom Patterson insisted. His wife, his kids, his students. The idea that he would take his own life is absurd. For Catherine Roberts and her children, the uncertainty was torture. At least, with death, there is finality, closure, a chance to grieve and move forward. But this was different. Michael wasn't dead, not officially. He was simply gone, missing, and the not knowing consumed them. Catherine spent the first week at the airport, refusing to leave, convinced that at any moment Michael would walk through the door with some incredible story about where he'd been. David, 17 and trying to be the man of the house, held himself together during the day, but his mother could hear him crying at night through his bedroom wall. Susan, just 15, stopped eating, stopped going to school, stopped talking. She would sit in her father's workshop for hours, holding his tools, staring at the unfinished model airplane they'd been building together. The underwater search continued for 3 full weeks, but the divers were limited by depth, cold water, and visibility. They checked every sonar contact in the target area, but found nothing. Old anchors, rock formations, pieces of unidentifiable debris. But no P-51 Mustang. By November 15th, exactly 5 weeks after the disappearance, the official search was called off. The Coast Guard and state police had exhausted every resource. They had searched over 200 square miles of Lake Michigan. They had investigated dozens of sonar contacts. They had found nothing, not a piece of the aircraft, not a trace of Michael Roberts. In a press conference that day, Detective Walsh's voice was heavy with defeat. "We have done everything humanly possible. We've used every piece of equipment available to us, but Lake Michigan is keeping its secrets. The bottom sediment in that area is soft and deep. It's possible the aircraft buried itself within hours of sinking, making it invisible to our sonar. Until we develop better technology for underwater searching, I'm afraid this case will have to remain open, but inactive." The airport held a memorial service for Michael Roberts on November 30th. Over 500 people attended. His old squadron commander flew in from Texas. Former students spoke tearfully about the man who had taught them not just to fly, but to respect the sky. Catherine sat in the front row, David on one side, Susan on the other, and stared at the empty space where a casket should have been. But there was no casket, no body, no evidence that Michael Roberts was truly dead. just the terrible, aching absence of a man who had simply vanished into a clear October sky. 6 months after the disappearance, the case was officially classified as a presumed fatal accident. Michael Roberts was declared legally dead. Catherine received his death certificate in the mail on a Tuesday afternoon. She held the paper in her hands for a long time, staring at the words, "Presumed dead. Body not recovered." The P-51 Mustang's insurance company paid out the policy. The airport retired Michael's instructor number. Life, as it cruelly does, moved forward. But for the Roberts family, and for the investigators who had spent weeks searching for answers, the questions never stopped. Where was the plane? Where was Michael? What had happened in those final moments? It would take 18 years for those questions to finally be answered. The years passed slowly for Catherine Roberts. She never remarried, never even dated, despite the gentle encouragement of friends and family. "How can I move on when I don't know?" she would say. "How can I close that chapter when it never really ended?" She kept Michael's workshop exactly as he had left it. His tools hung in the same positions on the pegboard wall. The unfinished model airplane, dust-covered now, sat on the workbench where he'd last touched it. Once a month, she would go in there, sit in his old wooden chair, and talk to him as if he might walk through the door at any moment. David Roberts graduated high school in 1958, went to the University of Michigan, and became the engineer his father had always known he would be. But he never flew, never even went near an airplane. "I can't," he told his mother once. "Every time I see one, I think about Dad out there somewhere, and I just can't." Susan fared worse. The trauma of losing her father at such a formative age left scars that never fully healed. She struggled through high school, battling depression and anxiety. She would eventually become a teacher, channeling her father's gift for patient instruction into working with children. But she, too, kept away from airports, from the sound of airplane engines, from anything that reminded her of that October day when her world had shattered. The mystery of Michael Roberts's disappearance became something of a local legend in northern Michigan. Every few years, someone would claim to have a new theory. In 1962, a psychic offered to help locate the plane, conducting an elaborate ceremony on the shores of Lake Michigan that produced no results. In 1965, a retired Air Force investigator published an article suggesting that Michael had been abducted by a foreign power, a theory so far-fetched that even conspiracy theorists dismissed it. The most persistent theory was the simplest. Mechanical failure had forced Michael to ditch in the lake, and the plane had sunk so quickly that he'd been unable to escape. This was supported by the eyewitness accounts of the controlled water landing. But if that was true, where was the wreckage? Lake Michigan wasn't the Pacific Ocean. The search area was only a few hundred feet deep at most. Why hadn't anyone found it? What nobody fully understood in 1957 was the unique nature of Lake Michigan's bottom in that particular area. The lake bed consisted of deep, soft sediment, almost like quicksand in places, created by millennia of glacial deposits and organic material. An object sinking into that sediment could be partially buried within hours as currents stirred up the fine silt and sand, which would then settle over and around the object. The autumn storms that came through in late October and November of 1957 had been particularly violent, with high winds creating powerful bottom currents that could have completely altered the lake bed in the weeks following the crash. Technology improved throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. Sonar became more sophisticated. Side-scan systems were developed that could create detailed images of the bottom. Underwater cameras became more common. Commercial diving operations expanded. Several times, Catherine received calls from salvage companies offering to search for the plane, usually for a substantial fee. She always declined. What would be the point? Michael was gone. Finding the wreckage wouldn't bring him back, but she never stopped wondering. None of them did. In the aviation community, the disappearance of Michael Roberts remained an unsolved puzzle. It was discussed in flight schools as a cautionary tale, though exactly what caution could be taken from it remained unclear. Don't fly over large bodies of water. Michael had done it hundreds of times without incident. Always file a detailed flight plan? He had. Maintain your aircraft religiously? Nobody had been more meticulous than Michael Roberts. The case was featured in a 1968 magazine article titled Michigan's Vanishing Ace, which brought renewed attention but no new leads. Private investigators took a crack at it over the years, interviewing the same witnesses, reviewing the same evidence, and reaching the same dead ends. The fishermen who had witnessed the crash were interviewed multiple times, but their story never changed. They had seen the plane go down, they had seen it sink, and then it had simply vanished into the lake. By 1975, 18 years after the disappearance, most people had forgotten about Michael Roberts. A new generation of pilots flew out of Traverse City Airport, and none of them knew the story of the veteran who had vanished. The hangar where Michael had kept his Mustang housed different planes now. Even the runway he'd taken off from had been resurfaced twice, all physical traces of that October day long gone. Catherine was 62 years old now, her hair white, her face lined with the years of uncertainty. David was 34, married with 2 children of his own who had never known their grandfather. Susan was 32, still single, still teaching, still carrying the weight of that loss. The Roberts family had learned to live with the mystery. They had no choice. They had held no funeral because there was no body. They had no grave to visit because Michael had no resting place. He existed in a terrible limbo, neither confirmed dead nor somehow miraculously alive. And then, on July 18, 1975, everything changed. The day started ordinarily enough for Mark Henderson and his dive team. Henderson, 32, was a commercial diver who had recently moved to Traverse City to start a recreational dive shop. Lake Michigan, with its shipwrecks and underwater formations, was a diver's paradise, and Henderson was building a reputation for leading safe, interesting dives. On this particular Saturday, he had taken a group of 6 divers out to a site about 8 miles north of Traverse City, an area known for interesting rock formations and, occasionally, fish that made for good photography. The water was clear, visibility was excellent, and the temperature at depth was a comfortable 62 degrees. The dive plan was simple: descend to about 30 feet, explore the area for 45 minutes, then surface. Nothing challenging, perfect for the mix of experienced and intermediate divers in his group. At 10:23 a.m., Henderson and his group descended down the anchor line. The lake bottom here was sandy with scattered rocks, exactly as expected. They spent about 20 minutes photographing fish and exploring a small rock outcropping when one of the divers, a young woman named Julie Morrison, signaled to Henderson and pointed off to the east. What she had spotted looked like a long, straight line in the sand, partially buried, but definitely metallic. Unusual. Natural formations are rarely that geometrically perfect. Henderson swam over. His curiosity piqued. As he got closer, his heart began to pound. That wasn't a rock formation. That was metal. Aircraft aluminum. And not just any metal. As he brushed away some of the sediment, he could see the distinctive shape. That was an aircraft wing. Henderson's mind raced. He knew about the missing P-51. Everyone who grew up in the area knew about Michael Roberts. Could this be it? After 18 years? He signaled to his team to surface and made his way back to his boat as quickly as safety allowed. Once topside, he radioed the Coast Guard immediately. "You need to get out here right now," he told the EB dispatcher, his voice shaking with excitement. "I think I just found the Roberts plane." Within 3 hours, the site was swarming with official vessels. Coast Guard divers descended to confirm Henderson's discovery, and what they found was almost unbelievable. The P-51 Mustang sat upright on the lake bottom at a depth of 22 feet. Not 30 feet, not 50 feet, 22 feet. Shallow enough that, in theory, it should have been found years ago. But the aircraft was positioned at a slight angle on a slope, partially buried in the soft sediment up to the bottom of the fuselage. The wings were almost completely covered with a layer of silt and sand, making them invisible to surface observation and nearly invisible to the primitive sonar of 1957. More significantly, the plane was located in an area that was littered with other underwater debris. Within a 100-yard radius, divers counted 7 old anchors, 3 sections of dock pilings, assorted, chains and cables, and the remains of what appeared to be a small fishing boat. In 1957, with limited sonar resolution, the Mustang would have been just one more metal object among dozens, easily overlooked or dismissed as another piece of lake debris. The aircraft itself was remarkably intact. The wings were still attached. The propeller was bent, but not shattered, suggesting a controlled impact with the water rather than a catastrophic crash. The landing gear was retracted, as it should have been for a water landing. Most significantly, the canopy was closed, and inside, still strapped into the pilot's seat with his safety harness secured, was the skeletal remains of Michael Roberts. The recovery operation took 3 days. A crane barge was brought in, and divers worked carefully to attach lift bags and cables to the aircraft. The lake had preserved the Mustang remarkably well. The cold water and low oxygen levels at the bottom had prevented significant corrosion. Aside from some deterioration of rubber seals and fabric components, the aircraft was structurally sound. On July 21, 1975, at 2:15 p.m., the P-51 Mustang broke the surface of Lake Michigan for the first time in 18 years. Water poured from every opening as the crane slowly lifted it onto the barge. Dozens of boats surrounded the site, filled with spectators, reporters, and people who remembered October 12, 1957. Catherine Roberts was there, supported by David and Susan on either side. She watched through tears as the silver aircraft, dulled by time and water, but still recognizable, emerged from the depths. "Thank you," she whispered to no one in particular. "Thank you for bringing him home." The forensic examination began immediately. The Michigan State Police, working with aviation accident investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board and the Federal Aviation Administration, spent weeks analyzing every inch of the aircraft. What they discovered painted a clear, if tragic, picture of Michael Roberts' final moments. The engine showed signs of catastrophic internal failure. A piston had fractured due to metal fatigue, an invisible stress fracture that had developed over time and finally gave way during the flight. The broken piston had punched through the cylinder wall and into the engine block, causing immediate loss of significant power. This explained the roughness Michael had reported at 3:47 p.m. He had managed to keep the engine running on reduced power long enough to reach a position over the lake where he could safely ditch. The control surfaces were all in the proper position for a water landing. The flaps were fully extended to reduce speed. The landing gear was retracted to prevent the aircraft from flipping forward on impact. The throttle was at idle. The trim tabs were set perfectly. Michael Roberts had done everything by the book. He had executed a textbook, emergency water landing. But here's where the tragedy deepened. The canopy was still closed and locked. In a water landing, standard procedure is to unlock or jettison the canopy before impact, ensuring an immediate escape route. Michael hadn't done that, and the investigators spent considerable time trying to understand why. The answer was found in the canopy mechanism itself. The P-51 Mustang used a sliding canopy system that moved backward on metal rails. When the aircraft hit the water, even in a controlled landing, the impact forces were substantial. The forensic analysis revealed that the aluminum frame of the canopy had distorted by approximately 3 millimeters, less than the thickness of 2 pennies. But that tiny distortion was enough to bind the sliding mechanism in its rails, making it impossible to open. The scratch marks on the interior of the canopy frame told the rest of the story. Michael Roberts had desperately tried to force the canopy open, but once the plane began taking on water, the external pressure made it impossible. The Mustang had floated for perhaps 10 to 15 seconds before the weight of water flooding into the cockpit pulled the nose down and the aircraft sank. Michael's wristwatch, a simple mechanical timepiece, had stopped at exactly 4:02 p.m. when water pressure destroyed its movement. The date wheel was still visible through the crystal. October 12th. He had been alive less than 10 minutes after his last radio transmission. Inside the cockpit, investigators found Michael still wearing his life vest, which he had apparently managed to inflate in those final seconds. But with the canopy jammed shut and the aircraft sinking rapidly into 22 feet of water, the life vest had only prolonged his suffering. He had drowned, trapped in the very aircraft he loved so much, unable to escape despite being in water shallow enough that he could have easily swum to the surface. The news hit the aviation community hard. Michael Roberts had done everything right. He'd maintained his aircraft religiously, but metal fatigue is invisible to even the most thorough inspection. He'd handled the emergency with skill and calm. He'd executed a perfect water landing. And yet, a microscopic distortion in an aluminum frame, a mechanical failure that couldn't have been predicted or prevented, had killed him anyway. It was a stark reminder that sometimes, in aviation as in life, you can do everything right and still lose. On August 15, 1975, Michael Roberts was finally laid to rest in Traverse City Cemetery. His funeral was attended by over 800 people. His casket was draped with an American flag. A missing man formation flew overhead, one plane breaking off to symbolize the fallen pilot. Taps was played. 21 guns fired their salute. And finally, after 18 years of terrible uncertainty, Michael Anthony Roberts came home. Catherine Roberts, now 62, stood between her adult children and watched as her husband was finally, mercifully, given a proper burial. "I always knew he was gone," she told a reporter later, her voice steady, but her eyes wet with tears. "But now I know where he is. Now I can visit him. And that makes all the difference." The final report on the loss of Michael Roberts's P-51 Mustang was published in November 1975, and it provided closure to a mystery that had haunted northern Michigan for nearly 2 decades. The official cause was determined to be catastrophic engine failure due to metal fatigue in a piston assembly, compounded by a jammed canopy mechanism that prevented the pilot's escape after a successful water landing. But the report also raised uncomfortable questions that went beyond this single incident. Why had the initial search in 1957 failed to locate an aircraft sitting in just 22 feet of water? The answer, investigators concluded, was a combination of factors that created a perfect storm of invisibility. The soft-bottom sediment that partially buried the plane within days of the crash, the primitive sonar technology of the era with its poor resolution, the sheer vastness of the search area spanning dozens of square miles, and, critically, the presence of numerous other metal objects on the lakebed that created false positives and overwhelmed the limited search resources available. The report led to significant changes in how aviation accidents over water were investigated and how search operations were conducted. Recommendations included the development of better underwater search technology, standardized procedures for marking witness locations during overwater accidents, and improved training for pilots on emergency canopy jettison procedures. The most haunting revelation was how close Michael Roberts had come to surviving. If the canopy had opened, if he'd had just 30 more seconds to escape before the plane sank, he would have been in water shallow enough to swim from easily. He was an experienced swimmer. The lake was calm that day. He was wearing his life vest, which he'd managed to inflate. He would have made it to the surface without difficulty. He might have been cold, might have been in mild shock, but he would have lived. Instead, the same meticulous preparation that had saved his life dozens of times during the war, the same attention to every detail, couldn't overcome two microscopic failures: a stress fracture in a piston invisible to human inspection, and a 3mm distortion in an aluminum frame. Sometimes, the difference between life and death is measured in fractions of inches and seconds. The tragedy of Michael Roberts wasn't that he made a mistake. It was that he didn't. He did everything right, from his pre-flight inspection to his emergency procedures to his water landing technique. And it wasn't enough. The P-51 Mustang itself underwent an extensive restoration and is on display at the Air Zoo in Kalamazoo, Michigan. It sits as a memorial to Michael Roberts and all the veteran pilots who survived war only to be claimed by the peacetime skies they loved. A plaque beside the aircraft tells his story, and every year on October 12th, pilots from across the country gather there to pay their respects. Catherine Roberts passed away in 1992 at the age of 79. She never stopped wearing her wedding ring. She visited Michael's grave every Sunday for 17 years, bringing fresh flowers and sitting on the bench nearby to tell him about her week. In her will, she requested to be buried next to Michael, and she was. Their shared headstone reads, "Together again, finally at peace." David Roberts, now in his 80s, eventually overcame his fear of flying in his 50s, earning his pilot's license in 2007. "I needed to understand what Dad loved so much," he said in an interview. "I needed to know why he kept going back to the sky. And now I understand. When you're up there, everything makes sense. Everything is clear. I wish I'd had the courage to do this while he was alive, so we could have flown together." Susan Roberts never flew, but she became an advocate for aviation safety, particularly focusing on emergency procedures and pilot training. She established a scholarship fund in her father's name that has sent over 50 young people through flight school. "Dad would have wanted to keep teaching," she said. "This way, he still is." Some mysteries remain unsolved forever. But Michael Roberts' disappearance isn't one of them. We know where he went. We know what happened. We know he died doing what he loved, in the cockpit of a legendary aircraft, trying to bring her home one last time. We know he fought until his last breath, trying to escape, trying to survive, trying to get back to the family waiting for him at Miller's Steakhouse for dinner at 6 o'clock. What we'll never, No is what went through his mind in those final seconds as the cold water of Lake Michigan closed over the canopy. Did he think of Catherine, waiting at home? Of David and Susan, who would grow up without him? Of all the missions he'd survived over Nazi Germany, only to end here, so close to home? The answer died with him on October 12, 1957, at 4:02 p.m., in 22 feet of water, 8 miles north of Traverse City, and rests with him still beneath a simple headstone in Traverse City Cemetery. But his story, and the 18-year mystery of his disappearance, will be remembered as long as pilots look up at the sky and understand that every flight, no matter how routine, carries risk. That preparation and skill matter, but sometimes they're not enough. That metal fatigues in ways we cannot see. That mechanisms fail at the worst possible moments. And that sometimes even heroes don't come home. Michael Roberts did everything right. Remember that. Honor that. And when you see a P-51 Mustang at an air show, its Merlin engine roaring across the sky, think of the men like Michael who flew them, who loved them, and who sometimes paid the ultimate price for that love.